Hello everyone, welcome back to the Hindu Explained series from Law Prep Tutorial. I am Kushagra Goyal and today we are going to discuss the November 11th newspaper. So first of all, yesterday as you know, the Bihar elections had taken place and most of the news is about that. Like election news is the most prominent one because politics affects everything. But nevertheless, from a CLAT perspective, not all of that is relevant for us. So on the front page, as you can see, there is news about who is leading, who is doing how much, where BJP is leading, how much has the JDU lost, and stuff about that. But that is not relevant for us. The only thing relevant from the front page for us is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit that had virtually taken place. So we are going to discuss that at a later point. I'm just going to skim through everything today as to what are we going to skip from the newspaper. So on the front page there is another news that we will discuss which is related to legal section. Then moving on to the regional ones, again nothing much here for us today. And then we arrive at the editorial page. So again today's editorials, most of them, the main editorial is about in Bihar the subdued narrative of the silent voter. So this is a political analysis of the voting pattern in Bihar and how much and how of that affects the political fortunes of each political party in Bihar. Sajjan Kumar is a political analyst, so that is not relevant for us from the CLAT perspective. And if you have followed us yesterday, we had discussed the Finance Commission. So today's editorial is first about the Finance Commission's report and how it is highlighting and understanding the finances from the state's perspective. There is a separate section. If you haven't seen that video, I suggest that you go back and watch that later on to understand more about this. And then on the other two editorials, on the left hand side is the dose of optimism, again following up from yesterday's news. So that is how it is becomes this consistency with this series becomes important because things will be following up. So this again is from yesterday's news. We will discuss it a little bit more later on. Then is the strengthening of public health capacities in disasters. So this is more policy concern. But we are going to nevertheless discuss it a little bit because from the perspective of understanding, there is the Disaster Management Act that is discussed in this editorial. So I am going to cover that a little bit. Moving on, again the op-ed page is covered by election news. It is entirely focused on elections. One is about the current Bihar CM Nitish Kumar and how this election was all about him and the mandate vis-a-vis his performance. On the right hand side is about unemployment finally becoming an election issue, how in this election unemployment and joblessness and growth in the economy had become a primary focus. On the bottom is about psychosocial support to community volunteers or people who are from vulnerable population because of the pandemic. So this is also another policy analysis which doesn't matter to us that much from a CLAT perspective. The entire electoral database also is purely political news. On the national news, again this page is also surrounded by political news. There is some other political investigative news, but what becomes most important for us again is following up from the Shanghai Cooperation Organization news, which is the this section on the left hand side, the third article on the left, which we will discuss, which relates to what the Prime Minister has stated at the summit. Moving on, again more political news, how and who has done what. Then there is a discussion about Manoj Naravane, our army chief. He is talking about the tensions at LAC. Not much new development. So nevertheless, that is not important for us at this point of time. What becomes more important here is India's mRNA vaccine may be ready by March. So mRNA vaccine is what we had discussed yesterday. Pfizer had released their efficacy report. So this is again relevant. The explanation of mRNA vaccines is something I had done yesterday. So I do suggest that you go back and watch that video. Then Again, following up more the magazine. Then from the foreign news, again, there is analysis. This is again analysis from following up from yesterday's editorial, which I had discussed, how Biden will fix America's hinges on the China challenge, how he tackles China becomes most important part of his foreign policy. So that is again a more policy concerned and nothing new in that news. Uh, the most important news on the foreign level is that Armenia and Azerbaijan agree on a peace deal. That is, we will discuss this in depth in this video. From the economics news, again, nothing much from our perspective. So again, skimming through that. Uh, on the sports news, Mumbai Indians won their 5th IPL title. They became the only team to have won 5 titles. They successfully defended the title, something that only Chennai Super Kings had done back in 2010-2011. So that is it from sports news again. Nothing much from record perspective for us to follow. So now moving on to the more in-depth analysis of what we have to study. The first is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So Prime Minister Narendra Modi delivered his speech virtually. As you know, travel is restricted during the pandemic, so all the summits are happening virtually. And on the same line, this year's Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit happened virtually. Prime Minister Narendra Modi did participate along with Chinese Premier Xi Jinping. Now, as you know, India and China are locked into border tensions. So it is a lot of political news that whether they will face. So, for example, at different summits, whenever Pakistan and India have been part of, there have been calls whether there have been speculation whether Prime Minister Modi will meet either Nawaz Sharif or currently Imran Khan, whether they exchange greetings. So none of that tension is possible, none of that is relevant because things happen virtually. But everyone participates and Prime Minister Narendra Modi did participate. Key takeaways from his speech we will discuss at a later point. Before that, a quick revision of what SCO is all about, because that becomes more important from GK point of view. Individual speeches may not be relevant. What is relevant is the principles discussed in each speech and the entire organizational structure and what is that becomes relevant for us. So exactly a quick overview of what the SCO is all about. So the SCO is an intergovernmental body. It is a permanent body that takes care of the political, economic and security concerns of its member nations. Now, SCO currently has 8 member nations. There were 5 original members who were known as the Shanghai 5 mechanism. As you know, it is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. China, Kazakhstan, Russia, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. They were the 5 original ones. 6th member edition was in 2001, Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan entered, and then the latest editions were India and Pakistan in 2017. So we, along with Pakistan, were the formal members of SCO from 2017 onwards. The last summit of SCO took place in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan in 2019. That becomes relevant. When was the last physical summit of SCO? Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. Then where is the secretariat of SCO located? Beijing. That is another relevant question. And then the last bit is RATS. RATS, what is RATS about? RATS is regional anti-terrorism structure of SCO. So SCO is primarily focused on anti-terrorism also. It has a special focus towards anti-terrorism. As you know, it is part of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's foreign policy initiative to bring terrorism in highlight, to highlight countries that sponsor terrorism primarily. You know who we talk about and who his focus is, and that has never been, he has been incessant, consistent talking about anti-terrorism, and RATS is a success story of that. The RATS structure is located in Tashkent. Tashkent's history, as you know, goes back to the days of Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri's untimely demise. So this is the brief overview of what this news is about. Now the brief overview of what is the background of what happened at the summit this year. Now, two terms became prominent from Prime Minister Narendra Modi's speech yesterday, which is territorial integrity and recognizing, respecting the sovereignty. Both these principles are part of the original Panchashil agreement, which was signed by Jawaharlal Nehru back in 1955 with China. So those two principles become relevant because when, as we know, that when China has intruded into LAC, it is not respecting our territorial integrity, it is not respecting our sovereign right over that territory specifically. So exactly that is what Prime Minister Narendra Modi was highlighting. His indication was also to the infrastructural development that China is undertaking on Pakistan occupied Kashmir, the POK, and he urged members, all the members including China, it is an indirect reference to China, that see, these are two important principles, and that is exactly what we need to, members cannot grow, or the organization or trust between the members cannot grow if we are not on the same page on these two agreements. The SCO's relevance for India is also highlighted in the article. It talks about the North-South corridor and the Chabahar port. Chabahar port is located in Iran. The North-South corridor is the corridor from Iran to Central Asia. Most of the countries from SCO are Central Asian countries which are untapped economic potential for India. They have a lot of nuclear enriched uranium which we can import from there. So moving on, along with more on this news. So Prime Minister Narendra Modi also highlighted how the UN has failed, UNO, and as a general organization has failed to keep up with time. It has failed, but it stated that because from next year onwards, India will be a non-permanent member of the UNSC, which is the chief body of UNO, and it said that hopefully the member nations of SCO will support India in its initiative of multilateralism, formed multilateralism and the realities of 21st century and expectations of all stakeholders of the world. So these principles become important because, as you know, India is a consistent supporter of multilateral world order, that there should be equality and it should not be either a one unipolar world where one superpower or two superpowers. Everyone should be treated equally, and in that regard he had stated that multilateralism as a principle becomes important. He sought support of members during India's tenure at UNSC, and he also stated that the Sanskrit phrase of Parivartan meva strimasti, that means that change is the only constant, that change, if we don't change, we become redundant, and that is how he highlighted UNO, that if UNO doesn't change, if it doesn't evolve with time, it will start losing its relevance, and that global governance will not be possible if UNO doesn't change with changing times. So these are again, this is what was the primary focus of the SCO. Another new thing that came up, initiative that Prime Minister Modi told the SCO countries, that the National Museum of India will host a Buddhist heritage for SCO countries in 2021. So in 2021 at our National Museum, we are going to host the SCO countries and highlight our Buddhist heritage. As you know, India is the country where Buddhism was founded. We have a lot of untapped Buddhist heritage, and China and a lot of Central Asian countries have a huge Buddhist population. So to highlight trade and our civilizational links with these countries, this exhibition shall take place in 2021 at the National Museum. So this is one policy initiative or a executive initiative that Prime Minister Modi highlighted, and apart from other principal levels, which was multilateralism, global governance, realities, and change, which is the only constant as per Prime Minister Modi's speech. So we need to keep that in mind. Moving on to the next news then, which was that Supreme Court refuses to lift stay on Delhi government's order to hospitals. Now this news is relevant in the sense that now, if you have been following news, Delhi has been contributing the highest number of per day COVID cases. Now when you know if cases are rising, we need more beds. So what the Delhi government had done is that it had passed an order and stated that 80% of ICUs and high dependency units at private hospitals to be reserved for COVID, only COVID. Now this was challenged. This order was challenged by other people, saying that if this is happening, other patients will be neglected and they will suffer, and that this order was then stayed by the Delhi High Court. Then the Delhi government had yesterday approached the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court then refused to lift the stay. It stated that Delhi High Court will be the body that will decide on this matter if they want to consider it or not. So we have to wait this. But what this highlights is that there is a lack of facilities to support COVID patients along with other patients. So it is a lack of health infrastructure in our capital city is what this becomes prominent. So this news becomes relevant in the sense of disaster management. Under what authority can governments do it? Can they really control the private hospitals? The virtue of them being private is that they are independent of the government. So can the government force them to do what it wants them to do? So that becomes a question which we will be following in the news. That is it from this particular news. We will be following it as more and more developments happen. Then is the new important news from international perspective. Now, if you haven't been following the news, or if you're unaware, there is a conflict, that a full-blown war-like situation had been going on between two Central Asian countries, that is Azerbaijan and Armenia, former USSR states, members of the USSR, and post disintegration of USSR, they had had a conflict in 1994, and then Armenia had overtaken a territory claimed by Azerbaijan known as Nagorno-Karabakh. So in this territory, which you can see in blue at this sort of an island area, is the Nagorno-Karabakh area. It is a disputed territory. Armenia claims that it is theirs. Azerbaijan claims it is theirs. But since 1994, it had been controlled by Armenia only. Native Armenians had driven out Azerbaijan people from this territory to Azerbaijan and taken control over this territory of Nagorno-Karabakh. In that war had favored Armenia, but full-blown hostilities had begun in September 2020, and now a peace agreement or an armistice had taken place between the two countries. The armistice has been brokered by Russia, President Vladimir Putin, and under that, Armenia will now, what is this peace deal about? Because I have told you what is the conflict. It is about this Nagorno-Karabakh area. The peace deal is about that Armenia will now give up the territories that it has lost to Azerbaijan in this war, along with some regions that it also has lost control. So it will be ceding. So now this agreement is in favor of Azerbaijan. The war began and Azerbaijan was coming out stronger. It claimed the second most biggest city of Shusha in Nagorno-Karabakh, and the territories that it has acquired will now be retained by Azerbaijan. So the peace deal is very much in favor of Azerbaijan. What becomes relevant from our perspective also regarding the peace deal are the capital cities of Azerbaijan and Armenia, some history about this area itself, and the countries involved in the peace deal. So, as per the peace deal, Armenia will be giving up this area, but will be retaining the control of the capital city of Stepanakert. Stepanakert is the capital city. The corridor linking Armenia to Stepanakert is known as Lachin Corridor. This corridor will now be patrolled by Russia. Russian military will now patrol this area to ensure that uh, supplies are provided but not military, so that more hostilities do not take place all over again, because this is the direct link of Armenia to Nagorno-Karabakh. Through this territory only they are able to reach Nagorno-Karabakh. If a third party patrols this area, then there is a check on whether Armenia is increasing the hostility, doesn't increase the hostilities in the future. So now Russia will control the Lachin corridor, which becomes relevant for us. And lastly, along with these three countries, Turkey will also be part of the peace deal. It didn't broker it, but it will be overseeing it because it is a close ally of Azerbaijan. Both Russia and Turkey have links with Armenia too, but they are closer to Azerbaijan. Their support has been to Azerbaijan. They believe that yes, Armenia had wrongfully taken away Nagorno-Karabakh from them, but nevertheless some part of the territory is now will be controlled by Azerbaijan. Uh, the article also tells us about the names of the prime ministers and the president. They also become relevant for general knowledge point of view. So the prime minister of Armenia is Nikol Pashinyan, and Azerbaijan has a presidential system. So Ilham Aliyev is the president of Azerbaijan. As you know, Russian president is Vladimir Putin, and Turkey has Erdogan as their president. So that is it from this news. We'll be following up if any other development happens. More detailed analysis is available to students on our current affair classes, for which you need to subscribe to the law prep courses. Moving on to the next bit of news, I'm just going to cover this editorial now in very short because this is not that relevant from our perspective. The author Soham D. Bhaduri, he is a Mumbai-based physician and public health commentator and editor of the Indian Practitioner, which is a journal for doctors. Now, he says that there are certain limitations to Indian private health sector and the public health sector needs to rise up to the challenge. He highlights that the private sector is unable to deal with large-scale pandemic-like situations, and therefore there is a need for public health to increase. As you know, in liberalized economies, such as US and such as US, private health sector is far more prominent than public health sector. In India, it is considered that the poor go to the public health sector and the rich go to the private sector. But when a pandemic happens, it happens to the rich and the poor together. It doesn't differentiate. So how do you deal with that from a government perspective is what Mr. Soham is telling us. And he tells us that the private sector cannot do this and the public sector has to pitch in. And his solution is that along with increasing the efficiency of the public health sector, there is need of integration of primary care. But what becomes more relevant for all CLAT students from this editorial is the Disaster Management Act. Of 2005. So this act is under which the government is able to regulate pricing of masks, sanitizers, other facilities, restrict the cost of testing, the procedure, who to recognize, who will be doing this, who will be treating. So all that comes under the Disaster Management Act. Before that, ad hoc laws were applied. Now Disaster Management Act is a more concise framework. It's a proper framework, a legal framework under which different methodology and medium and mechanisms are highlighted as to how we will deal with disasters. And exactly what the parliament had done, it had declared COVID-19 as a public disaster, and through which other kind of help can be flown through to individuals across the country. So this act becomes relevant. This is the only takeaway for us, that this act is the sole and one shop through which the government regulates us, regulates private sector or private hospitals, and how to deal with the pandemic during this time period. Moving on to the other two editorials which become important. First of all, the dose of optimism. Now, yesterday's news was about Pfizer's vaccine, and it had stated the mRNA vaccine. But what this highlights for us is that we need to increase our cold chain infrastructure. For vaccines to be successful, they need to be kept at -70 degrees temperature. Now, to do that, to supply that to various regions of India, we really need to step up our cold storage to keep vaccines at this temperature. Now, if we are unable to do it, the effectiveness of the vaccines will go down. And that is exactly what this article is more about. Following up, I really suggest to understand what the vaccine is all about, go watch the November 10th video. Rest everything is not that relevant. It also highlights India's vaccines that are under production, which is the Covishield by Serum Institute and also Covaxin. Covaxin is by Bharat Biotech. So these are two vaccines which are in phase 3 trial in India. The Pfizer vaccine is not in trial in India, and that is a concern that this article also highlights, that whether it will be available in India or not, we do not know yet. But nevertheless, what we need to know is that all these vaccines required cold storage, and that we need to step up. Moving on to the last bit of news for us today is from the Finance Commission. The editorial highlights that the Finance Commission's second report. So every year Finance Commission comes with one report, but the 15th one has come up with two reports. One is the distribution one, which is standard. And which there is a second report, which is the finances of the state. That is the new bit of news for us. It highlights how the article talks about the distrust between states and center regarding GST revenue shortfall and other things, and that it also tells us that only when the parliament session happens, we will come to know whether the government has actually accepted the recommendations of the 15th Finance Commission. But nevertheless, it highlights that there is a concern and distrust between state and center about the revenue that states can actually get. From the previous Finance Commission, the level of distribution was 42% to states directly, but it states that states realized that this distribution was actually less, that they received less money and center was able to get more. So the article is all about this. It is following up from yesterday's news, which I had explained in depth yesterday, what the Finance Commission is about, what is its purpose and what it is doing. But this is the editorial that highlights what I had predicted yesterday, that there is a concern among the states that their finances are not in order. There is a concern that their revenue is falling, and that is why this new report, this separate report by the Finance Commission, is a welcome step. So that is it. From general knowledge perspective, Finance Commission, what it has done, what it is body, what kind of body it is, what does it talk about, and what is the structure and nature of it, is all that we had discussed. This is article talks about their concerns and their distrust with center. So summing up, today we had discussed there is more news on international front, which is the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, and then there is the news about the Armenia peace talks, peace deal between Armenia and Azerbaijan, which will be more important for us. So do make note of both these things. They become the most important takeaway from your November 11 newspaper. And that is it from us today. Do subscribe to the channel, leave your questions in the comment section, and we see you tomorrow. Thank you so much.